Hello, welcome to our seminar on the history, art, science of sign making. I will be your guide. My name is Bill, short for Branislav Kovacevic. When I was asked to prepare this seminar on the history of signs, I accepted wholeheartedly, in large part because it would allow me to give back to this profession my gratitude for the experience of working with many extraordinary human beings. Indeed, without the generous guidance and mentoring of the very beginning of my young career, I would have moved on to some other field. The sign business has always been, for me at least, a people business, where perceptions are always in play and attempts to define and accommodate expectations visually dominated every working day. This is my thank you to the sign community. Before starting my career in the sign business, I worked as a junior commercial artist in an advertising agency for a year before switching to the art department of a major printing firm as an apprentice graphic artist. I became proficient in all of the skills required at the time, such as lettering, mechanical layouts, and airbrushing, all of the skills made obsolete by the computers today. After 18 months, I was required to join a union, to which I refused and left the company. I freelanced making posters. Before I answered an ad for a sign artist designer at National Advertising Signs. My interview with the art director sales manager began with a thorough and extensive tour of the facilities and concluded with a drawing test. I was asked to sketch a sign that I saw during the tour, a freehand, no ruler, and an 8.5 by 11 paper with an HB pencil. It was a 3 by 5 peinture CIL paint plastic face sign. I accomplished the task very quickly to my interviewer's total satisfaction and hired on the spot. And here I am 54 years later. First module of this seminar is the introduction and defining the role of the sign designer. The objective is to create a culture of continuous education in the art, craft, and science of sign making within the Pattison Sign Group and promote innovation. When I began in the sign business in 1964, signs were totally different, the demands were different, the marketplace and the types of signs, most of which today have completely disappeared. Signs, by their very definition, are ephemeral. They reflect the trends and the period of the times, and as soon as that changes, they disappear. You'd be hard-pressed to find a lot of the signs that I designed in 1964 up until very recently. They seem to disappear. If in preparing this thing, I try to think in terms of how this thing changed and how the signs changed and why they changed. And an article that I dug up in looking for documentation for this series, I found a letter to the editor of Signs of the Times dated in 1966, 67, 68, where the founder started as a sign designer and became president of his own sign company. He founded Neon Products in the US at that time, famous for creating neon clocks, advertising clocks. And what he describes in his article is very much what we see today. The transitions that he went through from posters to glass sump glass signs pushed through metal, through neon, and the subsequent integration of acrylic, which is where he basically retired when acrylic started really taking over. And it was very interesting because it's similar to what we are going to be talking about today, but updated from when plastic became king. The designer today, and all designers, need to think always in terms of trying to innovate. And innovation is a fusion of inspiration, usually triggered by a need, In the design business, the need is always present before us. We have the designer and the design needs in front of us. There's a specific need, and we try to respond. We apply invention and engineering, and it's based entirely on our knowledge and experience. That knowledge and experience has to be buttressed by sound research and a continuous desire to learn. All designs, visualization, and intuition. And you don't have to have a degree in design or a degree in art to succeed. As long as you have the desire to create and to be innovative, you will succeed. Thomas Edison is a great school dropout. Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, one of the greatest architects of all time, was a self-taught architect. Designers, but definition of a designer can be many things. Here are some that I consider supreme designers in their own field, and some ventured away from their field, most notably Hedy Lamarr, who was a Hollywood beauty in the 30s and 40s. She was also a mathematics whiz, and she's responsible at the root of what we have today, Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. Her mathematical analysis and work on developing guidance systems in war resulted in Wi-Fi and Bluetooth today. Ben Franklin, we know. Abraham Lincoln, he actually patented from his experience working on the Mississippi River on a riverboat, and where boats were prone to get stuck on sandbars. He found a solution. There was a need, and he invented one. This is a picture of what he created, and it was a system of liberating the boat, raising the boat away from the sandbar. It wasn't commercially viable, but it's still a patent, and it was a workable model. These are the design disciplines that emphasize how important it is for a designer not to focus only on the creative, on the aesthetic, but to be able to take that aesthetic design and carry it all the way to the end. Understand that what he's creating, all the phases of that creation, he must have a total mastery of or knowledge. Fashion design is a perfect example of this. He starts by understanding the human anatomy, and from there how to clothe it and what materials. He has to understand the technology of weaving and dyes. He has to understand all the other raw materials that go into fashion outfits. That includes leather. It includes even metal and brass and jewelry. And most of all, and most importantly, he has to have a sound knowledge of history. All of these design disciplines share that same requirement. You cannot just be a partial designer. You're a total designer. Just as you cannot be slightly pregnant, you have to be the complete designer. Most people who come into the sign business, people who become sign designers, usually segue from graphics, graphic design, printing firms, art schools, and some other visual disciplines. And when they get into the sign business, they become intimidated by the technical aspects. Well, you will see throughout this seminar that the days that I spent designing signs, I had many more considerations, technical considerations to incorporate into my designs than you have today. That's basically because we can summarize my experience when I started in the sign business that form followed the function. Today, function follows form. With the advent of LED, and this is a transition we're going through, the LEDs allow us to make skinny, thin letters, and we will demonstrate that, whereas in my day we had to make very serious visual compromises. And that's when you're intimidated, you have to control that which you're afraid of and try to incorporate it into your design the best you can. Defining design means that you have to really understand the object, that you have to understand the context, and that is the essence of designing. It's intended to accomplish goals in a particular environment using a set of components satisfying requirements subject to constraints. But you're creating a design in an environment an environment. Your signs are intended for the urban setting for the general public, but you cannot isolate yourself from the design, that the atmosphere or the environment that you're working in. It's essential. For you to be successful, you have to understand your own environment. That means the estimators, the project managers, the salespeople, the people in operations. That is all part of your design package. You define a roadmap. You have to be strategic in terms of color choice, metal, in order to achieve something. You have to always look for an alternative if what you are trying to, or what you have, is not practical, or if you're given colors that suddenly are too much of a challenge to be visible. You're always trying to be strategic. That's what your role is. You define specifications, you plan the parameters, costs, activities. You incorporate within that your knowledge of the installation problems. You have to also incorporate legal, political, social, a whole bunch of things, and that is an integral part of your designing. You maintain a composure in the face of resistance to change. That is also something that you need. You need to develop a little thick skin and patience with people. Don't see it your way, because this is all perception and dealing with perceptions and expectations. You have to also be able to adapt to economic realities. The competition is fierce. There are a lot of very good designers out there who are competing with you. You don't see them at all times, but that's what you need. You need composure and patience. The designer, most importantly, if it was one attribute that you really need, is that you be able to visualize things and think in 3D. You must possess strong spatial visualization skills. Even if you doodle and do stick figures, you have to put them in context. You have to be able to understand your environment. You need to create the ability to express the ideas in concrete forms. If it's not always easy, but the importance is beyond the verbal. You should be able to put things in three-dimensional terms. Your communication skills will improve accordingly. It's part of the concept of working as a team. You are part of a team. You will cover the area of the 3D explanation of a concept, and you leave the others to work out the philosophy of it. Problem and analysis solving, that goes with you understanding what the needs of production people are. And of course, you keep an eye on aesthetics. And part of keeping an eye on aesthetics, you have to be up with the latest trends, understand what the rest of the graphic world is doing. A natural curiosity about all objects related to the surrounding and the environment. That means essentially you cannot ignore architecture. You cannot ignore lighting techniques and technology that is now so prevalent in the urban setting. You have to understand the dynamics of the materials and how to use them. They're extremely important. It is like an artist who has to prime his canvas. He has to know how priming that canvas will help certain colors. He might decide to prime it a different color to create a certain effect. These are all parts of understanding your materials and the type of canvas and so on. Sufficient knowledge of architecture, you can't stress that enough, because we are sort of the orphans in the architectural world. We come in after the fact, and one of the things that we have to learn is an architect resents anything that's suddenly added to what he's created. So you have to understand his language. You have to understand how to incorporate your sign into his creation. You are the Johnny-come-lately who comes quite often with some crazy sign or channel letter, and you really have to know how to present that concept. In order to do that, you have to understand architecture. These are some of the basic principles or approaches to sign design that we know in the sign business. The KISS principle, there is more than one way to do it. That's very much like what NISA does. Any system is only as good as its alternative. The use-centered design, user-centered designs, and of course, the speculative design. This is when you're allowed, on the rare occasion, to go nuts, where you start with one concept and go with the other. You will see some of this in the course of this seminar. We will show you some of these speculative designs, some crazy, wild, and woolly things that come into being and are spectacular. But we will also be talking about the mundane and the everyday design issues that are also important to the bottom line of the company in order to remain successful. Good design habits. Exploring possibilities and constraints by focusing critical thinking skills to research and the special context of the subject sign. This is important. If you're talking, if as an example, you're designing an elegant Italian restaurant and whose name happens to be Renaissance, well, you have to be very careful with your choice of topography. This is the best example. I still, when I go to Las Vegas and I see Caesar's Palace, I look at that lettering and I say, what a poor choice that is, because it is more evocative of a Spartan or Greek alphabet than it is of Latin alphabet. That's just a small example, but then Las Vegas is Las Vegas. They can brutalize history and they get away with the lights and glitter. Redefining the specifications of design solutions, which can lead to a better guideline for sign fabrication. The sign industry is in transition, and we'll show this very clearly, from neon to fluorescent and LEDs. But the reason we will review the history of neon fluorescence is to emphasize the abilities that we had to adapt and to incorporate these constraints, technical constraints, as well as stumbling along with poor substrate knowledge. Managing the process of exploring, defining, creating signs continually over time. This is that goes to the importance of keeping abreast of what's going on and keeping in touch with all the latest developments in material improvements. Prototyping, modeling. I used to make models when I started in the business. That was a very commonplace, long lost, and it does. Maybe it's something that can be done, where you can improve the appearance. If it's difficult to explain visually or graphically, you can quite often do a prototype model, and that you have to understand that process too. Trend spotting, understanding the similar environmental fields, and of course observing firsthand, whenever possible, the processing of a sign order in a manufacturing facility. That is critical. You have to understand what they're doing with your design. If you understand it, you might be able to improve it in the next project. It's always the more you know about your environment, the easier it is for you to design. Now, for Module 2, we will be talking about letters and lettering, the very essence of who we are as a company. Looking forward to it. Please look in. Module 3, Visualization. Roughing out the initial concept for sales, client, and briefing. The importance of drawing, doodling, and formulating the components into the sign design, I will never stress that enough. It is crucial. I realize now that with the pressures and the deadlines that you face, and right in front of that computer, believe me, it's not only physiologically easier and better and more stimulating for the mind when you can get away from that screen, pull yourself to the side, get your sketch pad, get your favorite charcoal or B pencil, and doodle the concepts beforehand. Let yourself go nuts, trying to put yourself in the context of your project. We're going to show past techniques. We're going to show you how to think virtually. The ambient is your light source. Light and shadows count from elevation and on good paper. Controlling your creative exuberance. And if you can't read it, the sign is useless. Before the mouse, this is what I mean before the mouse. Before you tackle your computer, put it on paper. These are challenges. people want to know, how do you put stained glass letters on glass, and how would you do it? You have to understand the process, and they don't want any visible fasteners. So you explore it beforehand. You don't just draw a nice picture and assume it's going to be done by magic. This is the way you do it, and we'll discuss it even as we get along. We'll elaborate on it. The origin of the modern sign industry, selecting the right amongst the current polymers in use. We will talk about primarily of the original acrylic. We will put the new ones, the Johnny-come-latelys, in context, in comparison, but we must always bear in mind that the material that established the standards, that is your standard by which all others will be compared. The precursors to ACM, we will explore how the evolution of cladding a building, putting the cosmetic aspects of architecture, putting a new face on an old body, on an old building. That's always been a part of the sign business, because we come in there and we put the sign, and if we can put the sign on a better background, it's part of the design process, and it also helps the bottom line. After the mouse, well, this is just an example that after it's finished, it can be done. And here's the successful integration at the head office of Intac. Designing for the ideal light transmission. This is, of course, we relate that to the split personality of signs, Jekyll and Hyde, trying to accommodate the demands of transmitting the fidelity of transmitted color, and that's reflected with spectral ambient light. We'll explore the historical values of this and how we'll bring it up to date. Module 6, transmitted and ambient light. This is the area that causes the greatest grief in the sign business, traditionally from the very beginning, from the very early days of acrylic, with spray painting to pigmented, and now of course with vinyls, and soon to be applied with inkjet and the new digital printing technology. We will cover the sheet metal workmanship, the era of working and being able to make extraordinary shapes relatively easily, because we had extraordinary workmen, tinsmiths that were true artists. And we will look at them and review what they were able to produce in the 50s and 60s. Here, for example, the Steinberg's letters, they were constructed entirely of a product called stelvatite, and these were thermoformed faces to give texture. We were able to make oblique signs relatively inexpensively because of sheet metal knowledge. There's the granddaddy of the current Metro stores, Metro supermarket chains. These are all upright, thermoformed, panned and embossed faces, 3x12s, 3x15, and 3x18s. They were mostly all blade signs. Model 7, we're going to discuss the transition from sheet metal to aluminum storefront alternatives. This will be introducing the cast acrylic, the evolution of acrylic plastic, and then polycarbonates, its pros and cons, extruded sheets versus calendar cast acrylic, and then we will get into the PVC and its evolution of PVC, paint on paper, Panoflex, flex face, etc., etc. Module 8, well, we'll have fun with this one because this is designing pylons. We'll talk about the basic lollipop concept, a face on a pole, a double face sign on a pole, and then we'll go into the more esoteric types and using materials that you're not accustomed to seeing, and the ability to even eliminate that post and make the post itself part of the design. And we'll of course discuss monoliths. Module 9 will be devoted to the very first sign program, sign programs. There are more than one actually, but the one that was sort of the catalyst for all subsequent retail visual identity type signs. Retail visual identity was, of course, coined by the Addison Design Group, who created the shell program, the RVI-1 shell program in the early 90s. We will go through it from a philosophical point of view and also what it achieved in technical terms. Everything from pre-applied male-female formed faces to the ACM, the curvature of ACM, to the lighting, and so on. It's going to be devoted entirely to the concept of retail visual identity. Designers and architects, how to deal with them. The alpha, they're the bosses, and they're infallible. We're going to discuss their infallibility and how to deal with it. We're going to evaluate their knowledge of signs. We will prepare the reps for how to dealing with them, trying to get the reps not to be as intimidated as they usually are when dealing with them, and asking the right questions, the pertinent questions. Establishing a sketching dialogue. This goes back to visualization. You will win a designer or an architect a lot quicker when you can relate to his ability to talk with a pencil or with a pen. And if you establish that sketching dialogue, you're on your way. You're developing a rapport of trust and dependency on your expertise is going to be critical, and we'll discuss that. And of course, we'll touch on wayfinding. The sort of the caboose in the sign industry is wayfinding. Not all sign shops are comfortable with wayfinding, but we'll walk through that one too. Module number 11, we will show you that how design or designing a sign must include installation strategies. We're going to be showing you a sign that from the very beginning, from the very first shapes on paper, were ultimately translated into a site evaluation and how to put these signs up. These are going to be quite spectacular. You're going to enjoy this one. We're going to touch on adhesives, the history of composite materials, on the influences from the boating industry and so on, fenestration types, and case history. The most notable one will be the Olympic rings and maybe some helicopters if we get the chance. Now, module number 12, the future of brick and mortar promises, the impact of the internet. Of course, we know people are not supposedly don't go to Walmart anymore, they'll order online, that type of thing. But more importantly, how will that affect the brick and mortars, and how will the retail industry adjust to it? We will always be there, of that I'm convinced, but we will most likely have to incorporate integration of lighting and how to deal with the lighting industry. We can't really compete. We will work as partners. We'll find ways. We'll discuss new materials and techniques, trimless letters as an example. What is the future? What is the possibility of OLED, graphic 3D versus virtual 3D? The solar and wind power, that's on the horizon, we are sure. And of course, signs that are interactive. That is crazy, but we'll touch on it. Anyway, we're going to have fun, and I really hope you guys follow up, because I'm getting all myself pepped up on this. I'm looking forward to talking to you, and hopefully in the future we'll be speaking with you. Thank you, and looking forward to Module 2.